Hi there, Alex here at mixinglessons.com. In this video, we're going to talk about EQing the reverbs in your mix. When you add reverb, you're adding an entirely new signal to your mix. So in the same way that when you would add vocals or a guitar, you would want to EQ those signals to make them fit into your mix. When you add a new signal like reverb, that also needs to be EQ'd. So in this video, we'll look at how to EQ your reverbs and some different approaches to doing that and some of the benefits of doing that. Before we get started, if you're keen to improve your mixes in your home studio, then head over to mixinglessons.com/free-downloads and get a copy of my free EQ cheat sheet, my free compression cheat sheet, and my free vocal recording guide. Okay, so first and foremost, let's have a look at why it's often necessary to EQ your reverb. So I've just got a snare track here, and it's quite a tightly tuned snare, so there's not much low end in this snare track. Let's just have a listen to it without any reverb. Okay, and we've got this being sent to a aux channel with a reverb plugin. So let's have a listen to how things sound with the reverb. Okay, so you can hear now that there's actually quite a lot more low end. Let's just have another quick listen just to the snare drum without any reverb. And now let's have a listen to it with the reverb. So we've now got more low end, and the reason for that is that this reverb plugin is adding some low end into our mix. And in fact, we can just have a quick listen just to the reverb on its own. Now let's listen to the snare on its own again. Snare drum is quite tight, it's quite cracky, there's not a lot of low end in there, it's tuned up pretty high. Now let's listen just to the reverb. And so we can hear low end there that isn't in the snare track, and so it's coming from the reverb. And so this is something that we kind of have to be aware of when we're adding reverb to our mixes. A reverb plugin will add frequencies that aren't necessarily coming from the instruments that we're sending to them. So you won't necessarily just get reverb which sort of replicates the frequency response of the instrument that's being sent to the reverb. The reverb has its own frequencies and adds its own sort of frequency characteristics to our mix. And so if we're not careful, what can happen is we can be sending guitars, vocals, snare drums, all different kinds of instruments to a reverb channel. It's going through a reverb plugin, and we could potentially be adding quite a bit of low end to the mix, which could potentially make things quite muddy, or it could compromise the clarity of the low end in our mix. Similarly, reverb can also exaggerate the high end sometimes. So you might notice if you sent a vocal track to a reverb, you might notice it become more sibilant. The S's and the T's might become a little bit more harsh sounding. And so for this reason, we have to manage the frequency response of our reverb plugins, and we have to EQ our reverbs. So let's have a look at how to do that. Now, there are a couple of different approaches. I actually generally use both of them. So let's have a look. So the first thing I'll do is I will control which frequencies are going into my reverb plugin. So what I'll do is I will place an EQ plugin before my reverb plugin. And that way we can tailor which frequencies are going into the reverb plugin. So this is a little trick called the Abbey Road trick. What you do is you insert your EQ plugin before the reverb on your aux channel, and then what you do is you add a high pass filter and you set this to around 600 Hz, and you add a low pass filter and you set this to about 10K. And then I'll generally start with a 12 to 18 decibel per octave slope. You can use that as a starting point, and then you can have a listen to how the reverb sounds with that high end and that low end taken out, and then you can adjust the slope and the frequencies as necessary to get the sound coming out of your reverb plugin that you want by tailoring what frequencies are going into your reverb plugin. So this is the first way of doing it. You manage what frequencies are going into the plugin. But as we know, this reverb plugin is going to add its own frequencies anyway. So what you can also do is you can add an EQ plugin after the reverb plugin, and you can use this to tailor the EQ to fit into your mix. So I usually use both of these approaches in conjunction with one another. I try and get things under control by limiting how much high end and low end is going into the reverb plugin to begin with, and then I use the EQ plugin after the reverb to really tailor the reverb to the mix, make it sit in the mix just the way that I would with any other instrument. Now, with some reverb plugins, you might have EQ controls on there. Sometimes those EQ controls will be there to tailor what frequencies are going into the plugin. Sometimes they'll be there to tailor the frequencies that are coming out of the plugin. So you can have a play around with those, and if you have that option with your reverb plugin, then you don't necessarily need to add one before or after. But assuming that you don't have any EQ controls on your reverb plugin, you can use either one of or both of these approaches to EQing the frequencies that go into your reverb plugin and the frequencies that come out of your reverb plugin. Your reverb plugin might also give you control over something called damping, so you might have a damping parameter. Damping differs a little bit from other EQ controls on a reverb plugin. Damping actually controls frequencies over time. So if you have a high frequency damping parameter, that will actually control how quickly or gradually the high frequencies in your reverb die out. So that's another option that you've got available to you when you're thinking about EQing your reverbs. I hope you found this useful. Don't forget to head over to mixinglessons.com/free-downloads and get that free EQ cheat sheet, that free compression cheat sheet, and that free vocal recording guide. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.